The villagers were just settling down for the night when a loud noise tore through the sky. It was a sound they had never heard before, a roaring, thundering crash that shook the ground. Lights flashed in the distance and people ran out of their huts to see what was happening. Just beyond the edge of the village, in the thick bushes, lay the remains of a large, shiny object, broken and scattered across the ground. Smoke rose from it, filling the air with a sharp, burning smell. It was a plane, though most of the villagers had never seen one before. The people stood at a distance, whispering among themselves. "What is this thing?" one old man asked, his eyes wide with fear. "It fell from the sky," murmured another. They all stared, unsure if it was safe to go closer. Then, suddenly, a faint cry reached their ears. It was soft at first, barely noticeable over the crackling flames and the whispers of the crowd. But then it grew louder, a desperate, heartbreaking sound, the cry of a baby. At once, the villagers began to look around, searching for the source of the sound. "Did anyone bring a baby here?" a young woman asked. All eyes turned back to the wreckage, and there, in the wreckage of the broken plane, something small moved. Tiny fingers poked through the twisted metal, and a baby's wail filled the air, louder and more urgent. The villagers gasped, too shocked to move. But one woman, an older woman named Mama Ngozi, didn't hesitate. Her heart beat faster as she pushed through the crowd, ignoring the warnings of others to stay back. She was a strong, fearless woman, and the baby's cry tugged at her heart. "Stay back, Mama Ngozi!" someone shouted, but she didn't listen. She moved closer, stepping carefully around the sharp metal and pieces of broken glass. Finally, she reached the baby. It was a little girl, no older than a few months, her face covered in soot and tears. Somehow, by a miracle, she was unharmed. Mama Ngozi bent down, her hands shaking as she scooped the baby up into her arms. The baby cried even louder, tiny fists waving in the air. Mama Ngozi held her close, rocking her gently. "Hush, little one," she whispered. "You're safe now." The villagers stared in awe as she walked back towards them, the baby clinging to her. "Ah, did she survive?" someone whispered. "The plane is broken into pieces, yet the baby is unharmed." Mama Ngozi didn't answer. She could feel the warmth of the baby in her arms, and she felt something strange, a deep, powerful connection. She had no children of her own, and as she looked down at the baby, she felt a fierce, protective love filling her heart. That night, Mama Ngozi took the baby back to her hut. She laid her down on her only mat, covering her with a soft cloth. The baby had stopped crying now, her tiny fingers curling round Mama Ngozi's thumb. Mama Ngozi watched her, a soft smile on her face, wondering where the child had come from and what she was going to do. The next morning, the village was buzzing with news of the plane crash and the miraculous baby who had survived. People came from nearby villages to see her, peering curiously at Mama Ngozi's hut. But Mama Ngozi kept the baby close, not letting anyone come too near. She knew they were curious, but she was afraid they might take the baby away from her. As days passed, Mama Ngozi cared for the baby, feeding her, bathing her in warm water from the river, and singing her songs to help her sleep. She named her Chiamaka, meaning God is beautiful, for she believed it was a miracle that the little girl had survived. But as much as Mama Ngozi loved Chiamaka, a shadow of worry grew in her heart. She knew that the government or some officials might come looking for the baby. People talked about it, saying that someone would soon arrive to take her back. Late at night, when the village was quiet, Mama Ngozi would sit by the fire, holding Chiamaka close, praying that no one would take her away. She couldn't imagine her life without the little girl now. But then, one evening, while she was bathing Chiamaka by the river, a stranger arrived in the village. He was a tall man dressed in clean, official-looking clothes, and he asked the villagers about the plane crash and the baby they said had survived. The villagers pointed him towards Mama Ngozi's hut, whispering that he was there to take Chiamaka away. Mama Ngozi's heart sank when she saw him approaching. She held Chiamaka tightly, hiding her behind her back as the man reached her door. "Are you the one who found the baby?" he asked, looking down at her with a serious expression. Mama Ngozi swallowed, nodding slowly. "Yes, I am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at her for a moment, then at the baby in her arms. "She needs to be returned to her people," he said firmly. "The crash was reported, and authorities are looking for her." Mama Ngozi's heart pounded. She wanted to protest, to beg him to let her keep Chiamaka, but she knew she didn't have the power to refuse. She looked down at the baby, tears filling her eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. But before she could finish, Chiamaka began to cry, reaching out her tiny hands towards Mama Ngozi as if she understood what was happening. Mama Ngozi's heart broke as she held the baby close, not knowing what to do. The man watched her for a moment, noticing the tears in Mama Ngozi's eyes and the way the baby clung to her. He hesitated, shifting his gaze between the two of them, perhaps sensing the powerful bond that had formed in such a short time. "Look," he said, his tone softening slightly. "I understand that this baby has found comfort with you, but there are people looking for her family, searching for answers. I don't know if any relatives have survived, but the authorities will want to know where she is." Mama Ngozi held Chiamaka even closer, as if shielding her from the stranger's words. Her mind raced with thoughts and fears. She couldn't let this man take her, not after everything they had been through together. In the days since the crash, Chiamaka had filled her life with joy and purpose like she'd never known. "Please, sir," she began, her voice trembling. "This child. I have no children of my own. She has given me life, given me something to hold on to. I can care for her, love her, give her everything she needs. Please, let her stay with me." The man's face softened for a moment, but he cleared his throat, returning to his firm expression. "It isn't up to me," he said. "I'm only here to report on her safety, to let the authorities know she's alive and well. They will decide what happens next." Mama Ngozi's heart sank. She knew that this might mean Chiamaka would be taken far away, to a place where strangers would care for her. Strangers who didn't know her laugh, her cries, or the way she liked to be held. "But," the man added after a pause, "I'll be staying in the village for a few more days, gathering information about the crash. No one will come for her until my report is complete." A small glimmer of hope sparked in Mama Ngozi's chest. She knew she couldn't keep the baby forever, but perhaps she had a little more time. "Thank you," she whispered, bowing her head in gratitude. The man nodded and turned to leave, but as he walked away, Mama Ngozi felt a new resolve rise within her. She would make these days count. She would spend every moment with Chiamaka, giving her all the love she had to offer. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to keep her. That evening, as the village fell into its usual quiet, Mama Ngozi sat by her small fire, with Chiamaka bundled in her arms. She sang softly to her, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her as a child. The baby's eyelids grew heavy, and she soon drifted off to sleep, her tiny hand resting against Mama Ngozi's cheek. Mama Ngozi whispered to her, "No one will take you from me, my little one. You are mine, and I am yours." The next morning, Mama Ngozi visited the village chief. She explained her situation, begging him for help. She wanted to know if there was a way to adopt Chiamaka, to make her part of her family officially. But the chief looked at her with sad eyes. "Adoption is not common here," he explained gently. "And with the authorities involved, it will not be easy. But I will support you, Mama Ngozi, and do what I can." With the chief's encouragement, Mama Ngozi felt a new determination. She would do whatever it took to keep Chiamaka safe and close to her heart. Over the next few days, Mama Ngozi visited with elders and respected villagers, gathering their support. She knew it was a long shot, but she needed to show the stranger that the entire village wanted Chiamaka to stay. The villagers, who had at first been wary of the baby from the plain, began to come around, touched by Mama Ngozi's love for the little girl. They brought small gifts, blankets, baskets of fruit, charms for protection. They whispered their blessings over her, saying she was a miracle, a child who had survived the unthinkable. Finally, the day came when the man from the city was ready to leave. He called a meeting with the chief and the villagers, explaining that he had filed his report. "The authorities may send someone to retrieve the child soon," he said, his voice steady, "but I'll share with them your wishes. Mama Ngozi's heart raced. She could feel Chiamaka's warmth against her chest, the little one holding tightly to her as if sensing the tension. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "tell them that she has a home here. She has a family, a village that loves her. Tell them that I will raise her as my own." The man looked around at the gathered villagers, seeing the hopeful faces, the soft smiles, the way they all looked at Chiamaka as though she was one of them. He nodded, a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "I will tell them," he promised. As he left the village, Mama Ngozi felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. The waiting began, every day filled with anxious glances towards the road, wondering if someone would arrive to take Chiamaka away. But until that day came, Mama Ngozi cherished each moment. She taught Chiamaka her first words, fed her with the best foods she could find, and wrapped her in blankets sewn by the village women. The villagers continued to come by, each one bringing gifts or offering blessings, as if to protect Chiamaka from any force that might separate her from Mama Ngozi. One night, as the stars shone brightly above, Mama Ngozi looked down at Chiamaka, now sleeping peacefully in her arms. She took a deep breath, hoping with all her heart that the gods, or fate, or whatever powers had saved Chiamaka from the crash, would allow her to stay. But in her heart she knew that the future was uncertain, and with every day that passed, she dreaded the possibility that she would lose the child she had come to love more than anything else in the world. Days passed quietly, with Mama Ngozi and Chiamaka settling into a comfortable routine. Each day was filled with laughter, songs, and the warmth of shared love. The villagers, who had at first been cautious around the child from the sky, now adored her. They brought small gifts, clay toys, colorful beads, and carved wooden animals for Chiamaka to play with. But as peaceful as things seemed, there was a lingering tension in Mama Ngozi's heart. Each time she heard a sound in the distance, she would look up, wondering if someone had come to take Chiamaka away. She kept her close, even sleeping beside her at night, fearing that if she let her out of her sight for even a moment, she might lose her. One sunny afternoon, while Mama Ngozi and Chiamaka were in the small garden behind her hut, two women entered the village. They looked different from anyone the villagers had ever seen. They smelled different. They wore fine clothes that shimmered in the sunlight, and their eyes were sharp, as if they were searching for something. The villagers gathered to watch as the women approached, whispering to one another, wondering who they were and what had brought them to their village. The women ignored the curious stares, their focus unwavering as they walked directly towards the village chief's hut. Mama Ngozi felt a shiver of fear pass through her. She held Chiamaka tightly, watching as the women disappeared into the chief's hut. She had a sinking feeling that they had come for the baby, though she hoped, prayed, that it wasn't true. After what felt like hours, the chief came out of his hut, his expression grave. He called for Mama Ngozi, and her heart began to pound. Slowly she walked over, holding Chiamaka close to her chest, her face pale and eyes wide. "Mama Ngozi," the chief began, his voice heavy with sympathy. "These women claim to be Chiamaka's relatives. They say they have been searching for her since the plane crash." Mama Ngozi felt the world tilt. Her knees grew weak and her grip on Chiamaka tightened. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's my daughter. I am her family now." One of the women, a tall, elegant woman with sad eyes, stepped forward. "I understand this is hard," she said gently, looking at Mama Ngozi with compassion. "We didn't know if anyone had survived. But when we received word of a baby found in the wreckage, we came as quickly as we could." The second woman, who looked younger and was holding back tears, reached out, her eyes fixed on Chiamaka. "She's our sister's daughter. Our family has been devastated and we thought we'd lost her too. We only want to bring her home where she belongs." Mama Ngozi's chest tightened, her heart aching. She wanted to scream, to beg them not to take Chiamaka away. This little girl had become her life, her joy, her reason for waking up each morning. How could they expect her to let go? "Please," she began, her voice cracking, "please let her stay. I have cared for her. loved her. I have become her mother." The tall woman shook her head gently, tears gathering in her eyes. "We are grateful for all you have done, but she is our blood, and we promised our sister we would protect her child if anything happened to her." The village chief placed a comforting hand on Mama Ngozi's shoulder. "They have a right to take her," he said softly, regret filling his voice. "You have been a good mother, but they are her family by blood." Mama Ngozi's heart shattered as she realized there was no way to keep Chiamaka. She looked down at the little girl in her arms, who was watching her with bright, trusting eyes. Gently, she brushed her fingers across Chiamaka's cheek, memorizing every detail of her face. The tall woman reached out, her hands open. Mama Ngozi hesitated, her arms tightening around Chiamaka, not wanting to let go. But deep down, she knew she had no choice. With tears streaming down her face, she leaned down and pressed a kiss to Chiamaka's forehead. "I love you, little one," she whispered. "Always remember that." Finally, with shaking hands, she placed Chiamaka into the arms of the tall woman. The baby let out a soft whimper, her tiny hands reaching back toward Mama Ngozi, as if she understood what was happening. Mama Ngozi turned away, unable to bear the sight of Chiamaka being taken from her. She stumbled back to her hut, her vision blurred by tears, her heart feeling as if it had been torn from her chest. The women thanked the chief and the villagers for their kindness, and then, holding Chiamaka close, they walked away, disappearing down the dusty road leading out of the village. For days, Mama Ngozi could barely bring herself to eat or drink. She lay in her hut, staring at the empty space where Chiamaka used to sleep beside her. Her heart ached with every beat, each one a painful reminder of the loss she had suffered. The villagers tried to comfort her, bringing her food, sitting with her in silence, and offering gentle words of encouragement. But nothing seemed to ease the pain. She felt hollow, as if a part of her soul had been taken away along with the child she had come to love. At night, she could still hear Chiamaka's soft giggles, could still feel the weight of her tiny body nestled in her arms. She reached out to touch the empty mat beside her, half expecting to find Chiamaka there, only to be reminded of the heartbreaking reality. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Mama Ngozi began to move around the village again. But she was a shadow of her former self, quieter and slower, her eyes holding a sadness that seemed to touch everyone around her. One evening, as she sat by the river, staring into the water, she whispered a soft prayer. "Wherever you are, Chiamaka, may you be happy and safe, and know that I will love you always." The river flowed gently, carrying her words away, and for a brief moment she felt a sense of peace, as if Chiamaka's spirit had heard her and sent back a whisper of love. Back in the city, Chiamaka's relatives were beginning to feel the weight of their decision. They had taken her into their large, comfortable home, thinking she would adjust quickly and that love and time would heal her sadness. But from the moment they arrived, things had been far from easy. Chiamaka cried constantly, her little face red and tear-streaked, her voice echoing through the halls day and night. She didn't recognize the new faces around her, and her cries became louder whenever one of her aunts tried to hold her or rock her to sleep. The familiar warmth of Mama Ngozi's arms was missing, and each new face only made her little heart ache more. Her aunts tried everything to comfort her. They surrounded her with colorful toys and soft blankets, hoping to capture her attention. They bought every type of baby food they could find, from sweet purees to warm cereals, arranging them on a little tray in front of her. But Chiamaka refused to eat, turning her face away from every spoon, shaking her tiny fists in protest. Days passed, and still, she would not eat. Her cries grew weaker, but no less constant, as her energy waned. The tall woman, who was her closest aunt, held her with worry in her eyes. "She needs to eat," she whispered, glancing at her sister. "She's growing weaker, and the doctor said she'll get sick if she doesn't start eating soon." They tried everything they could think of. Her younger aunt tried singing lullabies, rocking her gently in her arms. But Chiamaka's cries only grew louder, her small face scrunched in sadness. The aunts exchanged worried glances, exhausted from sleepless nights spent trying to comfort her. They missed the quiet mornings and peaceful nights they had once taken for granted. Now every morning began with the sound of Chiamaka's desperate cries echoing through the house, pulling them from their beds. They called the doctor again, explaining the situation, hoping he could give them some advice. "It sounds like she's grieving," the doctor explained gently. "Babies may not understand loss the way we do, but they feel it just as deeply. If she had a close bond with someone else, it may take time for her to adapt to her new surroundings." The aunts felt some guilt as they realized the depth of Chiamaka's attachment to the village woman who had cared for her. But they were at a loss for what to do. One morning, after another sleepless night of listening to Chiamaka's heartbreaking cries, the tall aunt finally slumped into a chair, her face buried in her hands. She hadn't known how attached Chiamaka had been to Mama Nguzi, hadn't understood that taking her from the village would bring her so much pain. "What are we going to do?" she whispered to her sister. "She won't eat, she won't sleep. Every morning she cries as if her heart is breaking, and I don't know how much more we can take." Her sister sat down beside her, sighing heavily. Maybe we made a mistake," she admitted softly, glancing at Chiamaka, who lay on a soft blanket nearby, her face still wet with tears. "Maybe we should have left her with the woman who cared for her. She needs love, and she needs someone she trusts. We can't replace that bond." The tall aunt looked at her sister, considering her words. The thought of taking Chiamaka back to the village crossed her mind, but it felt like admitting defeat. They had come so far to bring her back, thinking they were rescuing her from a life of hardship. But perhaps they had only taken her away from the only real happiness she had ever known. Days passed, and still Chiamaka cried. Her cheeks grew thinner, her cries weaker, but the pain in her tiny voice was clear. The aunts found themselves unable to sleep, haunted by the knowledge that they might be the reason for her suffering. Finally, one evening, the tall aunt stood by the window, watching the lights of the city below. She could hear Chiamaka's soft whimpers from the next room, a sound that had become all too familiar. Her heart ached as she thought of Mama Nguzi, the woman who had loved and cared for this child without question, without expectation. "We have to do what's right for her," she murmured to herself. Turning to her sister, who sat across the room, she took a deep breath and said, "I think we need to go back to the village. Maybe she belongs there after all." Her sister looked at her, surprised. "Hell no, she doesn't, and must not leave our sight," she replied. And then she looked towards the door where Chiamaka's cries was coming from, and then sighed, shaking her head. Days later, the house felt heavier than ever. The constant cries of Chiamaka echoed through the walls, leaving everyone drained. In a bid to ease the burden, they employed 2 nannies. The hope was that professional care would calm Chiamaka and bring some peace to the household. At first, the nannies seemed confident. They walked in with smiles, assuring the aunts that they had dealt with fussy babies before. They tried different methods, playing soothing music, singing traditional lullabies, and even taking her on walks around the compound. But Chiamaka remained inconsolable, her tiny fists clenching as her cries pierced the air. "She's grieving," one of the nannies said after the first night, her face pale from lack of sleep. "This is more than just a child missing home. She's mourning something deeper." By the 3rd day, the cries had gotten to the first nanny. That morning, as the tall aunt entered the living room, she found the woman packing her things hurriedly. "I'm sorry, Ma," the nanny said, avoiding eye contact. "I can't do this anymore. This child's cries. It's like she's in pain, and it's too much for me." Before the tall aunt could respond, the nanny picked up her bag and walked out. The door slammed softly behind her, leaving a tense silence in the air. The remaining nanny stayed, but her patience was wearing thin. Her once cheerful demeanor had turned sour, and she avoided staying in the same room with Chiamaka unless it was absolutely necessary. One night, the tall aunt approached her sister again. She sat down heavily on the couch, her face lined with worry. "Can't you see it?" "Nikechi," she said, her voice low but firm. "This child is suffering here. We've tried everything. But she's not eating, she's not sleeping. And now, even the people we've hired to help are leaving." Nkechi, the younger aunt, crossed her arms stubbornly. "So what are you saying, Ada? That we should just take her back?" After all we've done to bring her here. You know how hard it was to convince everyone that we could give her a better life." "But is this a better life?" Ada shot back, gesturing toward the room where Chiamaka's cries had grown weaker but no less heartbreaking. "She's not happy here. We took her from the only home she now knows, from the only person who truly loved her. What kind of life is that?" Nkechi didn't respond immediately. She turned her gaze toward the window. After a long pause, she finally said she'll adjust. She just needs more time, but time wasn't on their side. The next morning, the remaining nanny walked into the kitchen, her bag slung over her shoulder. "Ma, I'm sorry, but I can't continue," she said flatly, avoiding Ada's questioning gaze. "I've tried, but this is beyond me. I don't think anyone can help that child if she's not with the person she wants." And with that, she was gone. The house was quiet after the nannies left, except for Chiamaka's faint cries from her crib. Her voice, once loud and strong, had grown weak and hoarse. Ada couldn't take it anymore. She stormed into the room where Nkechi was sitting and slammed the door behind her. "This is madness," Nkechi, Ada exclaimed, her voice trembling with frustration. "The nannies are gone. The child is wasting away before our eyes, and you're still clinging to this stubborn pride. For what? To prove that we can take care of her. At what cost?" Nkechi sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Ada, you're blowing this out of proportion. She'll be fine." "Babies cry, it's normal," Ada repeated, her voice rising. "You call this normal? Look at her, Nkechi. She's not just crying, she's suffering, and we're doing nothing to help her." Nkechi looked away, her expression unreadable. For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. But she quickly shook her head, pushing the thought away. "We'll find another nanny," she said quietly. "Someone more experienced. Someone who can handle this." Ada shook her head, defeated. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about finding another nanny. This is about what's best for Chiamaka. And right now, what's best for her isn't here. It's with Mama Ngozi." The mention of Mama Ngozi's name hung heavily in the air. Nkechi flinched, but she didn't respond. Ada took a deep breath, her voice softening. "I know you mean well, Nkechi," she said. "We both do. But sometimes love means letting go. We need to think about Chiamaka, not ourselves." The conversation ended there, with no resolution. That night, as Ada lay in bed, she listened to the faint sound of Chiamaka's cries from the next room. Tears filled her eyes as she realized that the child's voice, once strong and full of life, was now barely more than a whisper. The next morning, Ada made up her mind. She walked into Nkechi's room, her expression resolute. "We're going back to the village," she said firmly. "With or without you." Before Nkechi could respond, the sound of Chiamaka's cries filled the house once more, louder and more desperate than ever before. This time, even Nkechi couldn't ignore the pain in her tiny voice. Ada rushed into Chiamaka's room, her heart pounding when the baby suddenly stopped crying. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The tiny figure in the crib lay disturbingly still, her once loud and heart-wrenching cries replaced by an eerie silence. Ada froze. For a moment, she thought her eyes were deceiving her. "Chiamaka," she screamed, dashing to the crib. The child's tiny body was cold, her face pale. Ada shook her gently, hoping for even the faintest response. Nothing. "Nkechi," Ada yelled, her voice breaking. "Nkechi, come quickly." The younger aunt came rushing in, her irritation at Ada's insistence from earlier instantly replaced by panic when she saw Chiamaka. "What happened?" Nkechi's voice trembled. "She's not moving." Ada sobbed, cradling the lifeless child in her arms. "We need to get her to the hospital." Now, without waiting for a reply, Ada bolted out of the room with Chiamaka, Nkechi trailing behind her. The drive to the nearest hospital felt like an eternity. Ada's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with prayers and worst-case scenarios. "Please, God," she whispered. "Please don't take her away." When they arrived, the nurses sprang into action. Chiamaka was whisked away on a stretcher, leaving Ada and Nkechi in the cold, sterile waiting room. Ada paced back and forth, tears streaming down her face. Nkechi sat silently, her head in her hands, guilt etched deeply into her features. Minutes turned into hours before a doctor finally emerged. "She's stable for now," the doctor said, his tone grave. "But her condition is critical. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished." "What happened to her?" Ada opened her mouth to speak, but Nkechi cut her off. She hasn't been eating or sleeping well," Nkechi admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been trying to care for her, but she's been crying nonstop." The doctor's brows furrowed. This child's body is shutting down from exhaustion. Whatever the reason for her distress, you must address it immediately. She needs rest, nourishment, and most importantly, comfort. If this continues, she may not survive." The words hit Ada like a thunderclap. She nodded, unable to speak. "You can see her," the doctor added. But only one at a time. Ada didn't wait for further instructions. She rushed into the room where Chimaka lay, her small body hooked up to IV drips and monitors. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Ada's heart broke as she sat beside the bed, gently stroking the child's tiny hand. "I'm so sorry," my darling," Ada whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have listened sooner. I should have taken you back." Behind her, Nkechi stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of guilt and sorrow. She watched as Ada poured her heart out to the unconscious child, the weight of her own stubbornness pressing heavily on her chest. "I was wrong," Nkechi finally said, her voice shaky. "You were right, Ada. We should have taken her back." "I see that now." Ada turned, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and sadness. "It took this, Nkechi? It took Chimaka lying here, fighting for her life, for you to realize that." Nkechi looked away, unable to meet her sister's gaze. "I thought I was doing what was best for her." I thought. Her voice trailed off. Ada stood, her fists clenched. "This isn't about what we think is best. It's about what Chimaka needs. And what she needs is Mama Ngozi." Before Nkechi could respond, a nurse entered the room. "You'll need to step out now," the nurse said. "We need to run some additional tests." Reluctantly, Ada and Nkechi left the room, returning to the waiting area. The silence between them was heavy, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Nkechi broke the silence. "We'll take her back," she said, her voice firm. "As soon as she's strong enough, we'll take her back to the village." Ada glanced at her sister, surprise flickering across her face. "You mean that?" Nkechi nodded. "I mean it. I see now that we can't force this. She belongs with Mama Ngozi."